Everybody, this is the Cultural Data Analytics Kudan Open Lab Seminar. Today is February 26th, and we have the great pleasure to have Piotr Adamczyk, who worked for Ithaca, and before that for the Google Art project, and before that I think you did work with the Metropolitan Museum. So he has been in a role which is fairly unconventional, somewhere between what I would say a CTO and a digital humanities specialist. And this is sort of something which is one of the most sought after genres of people in companies, not only in the cultural heritage, but at the same time, it's sort of a niche which is very hardly ever talked about, which is a quite interesting thing, because even in projects, and I think this is totally true for all the projects we do here in cultural analytics, but also digital humanities, there is this kind of work which for some of us feels like 85% of the work, which is data preparation, data analysis, infrastructure, getting data from A to B, transforming data and so on, which is sort of like the bulk of the work that needs sort of the same kind of attention as data warehousing, data management, data wrangling, data whatever, in large industry enterprises, and often is more complicated because the data we work with is not as clean, because people don't fill out text forms. We deal with, like, you know, unstructured information from the centuries. So fresh heaps behind green houses. So this is sort of something which I think is sort of something which is of great interest to all of us, and we're looking forward to hear more about how did you come where you are, and what are your thoughts in the situation of what, you know, sort of as a community, research and industry should think more about.
No, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. I think I'll definitely cover a lot of those points in the slides. Honestly, today I just wanted to introduce a couple of different projects that I had worked on over that history, and then ask you all some questions about where you think those limits are in terms of what it is that we can build with the data sets that we have, as partial and as gappy as they are. So let me share my screen really quick. So this is an art installation by an artist named Eric Cassels. He had printed out all of the Flickr photos that were uploaded in a single day. This was back when Flickr was a big thing. But one of the interesting things about the project, or at least that I found particularly interesting when I found out, is that there's a lot of foam and cardboard underneath those mountains of images. So there's a very thin veneer, a very thin layer of images, but it still looks like an incredible amount, and still more than you could possibly ever go through. But already there's a scaffolding, and there's an artifice and a dishonesty to the project, just in terms of the scope and scale and size. I mean, it was big enough already. The mounds don't need to be that much bigger, but there's already that aspect to it. So that's kind of what I'd like to kind of touch on, is what's present, what's absent in these cultural projects that we do, these large aggregations that we do, and how much of this can we expose to people as we work on it. So my background is kind of summarized on this slide. Essentially, I started as a math and computer science undergraduate at Illinois, working kind of very traditional numbers, computer science. One path would have taken me to Microsoft, where I would be working on graphics drivers, and I was supposed to work on the Xbox. But I decided against that. I went back to grad school and took a break, and ended up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I had some artist residencies in between at I-Beam in Brooklyn, and at the Banff Center in Canada. And you'll see a little bit more of the trajectory, but then I ended up at Google, went back and forth between Google and grad school, where I worked more on the library science and the human factors engineering side. After Google, I ended up at JSTOR, So Ithaca runs both JSTOR and Artstor. And those are large scholarly aggregations of images and articles and books. And just recently, actually, I made a change and I shifted over to a company called, an org called DataCite. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but it creates DOIs for datasets. So kind of like Crossref or ORCID, not just for datasets, mind you, but all sorts of also physical specimens, any kind of large studies that rely on data and rely on repeatable research. So they also for cultural heritage data sets, mind you, but primarily in the sciences so far. They've been focused on creating and aggregating a lot of data. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, I don't see in my current view, I don't see the chat window and questions, but if anyone has any questions or anything else, please either chime in or leave a question in the chat and I'll try to get through the slides pretty quickly. They're really just meant to prompt some conversation. So when I joined the Metropolitan Museum of Art, this is kind of what I expected it to be like. The curator kind of unveiling this beautifully organized collection of specimens of all kinds, everything in its right place and ordered just right. But of course, this is where I spent most of my time, which is in the data on the back end. So this is just one of the tables. I think this is American Decorative Arts. And if you can see a little bit closer on the screen, this is just the geography view for the objects in the American Decorative Arts wing. And right away, you've got in the geocode column, you've got things like made in, but then you've got probably made in, and then you've got null regions, you've got quotes, you've got one that's possibly made in New York, or it was made in India. We're not quite sure. And we were expected to kind of build the website based off of this data and be able to tell people stories based on all of this information. And these were just, you could see all of the tables over on the left. And those were just the tables that were present and able to power the website, but not necessarily all the ones that included the information that we didn't expose to the public. Or as in recent cases at international museums that, there's records that just don't exist for the public or that haven't been cataloged yet entirely. So trying to kind of get all of this information together, which of an institutional history that went back 100 years and all of the different people that went into generating that data, trying to understand what made it into this database and how it got there was a task in and of itself. At the time, I was really kind of fascinated by aggregating things with APIs. So this is a slide from Digital New Zealand. They kind of did a project, but on a national scale, basically aggregating a lot of their cultural content along with government materials and all the rest of it, trying to make it into a single metadata format and through an API powering all sorts of other features across the country. I tried to do something similar using all of these APIs that were available at the time. So you'll see the dated by some of the logos and how old some of these things are. Delicious is a good example for tags and TinEye and some of these other things. But essentially I used Yahoo Pipes. I don't know if anyone remembers Yahoo Pipes, but it was a very simple visual programming language where you could just drag and drop what you wanted in terms of the information. And you could generate RSS feeds and other simple HTML chunks based on that information to generate larger pieces of code. And in my case, what I did is I scraped the Metropolitan Museum's public website, which you see over on the right. And that chunk of information in the red square is replicated over in the top left. And all of the rest of the information on the page was things that I was able to pull from different APIs. And I showed this to the curators and to the staff, and they found it really fascinating, but at the same time kind of daunting. That, if you took the dates and you took the names of the artists and the names of the artworks themselves, or you looked at the summarizing text that was in the abstract and the description, that there was so much additional information that there was no way that they were going to be able to approve or allow for some of that content to show up on the website, even though it would be incredibly helpful in some cases for the patrons. So this was, again, how taking what seemed like a very small bit of information from the museum you could already start growing it and making all these connections on the open web, which was one of the things that museums were trying to do at the time. Google came around at the time, it was called the Art Project. It was 17 museums, and the back end was a couple of Excel spreadsheets that essentially the 20% project that was kind of proof of concept. Initially, it was all about getting both street view photography and high resolution gigapixel photography in the institutions, and trying to figure out if other Google technology would be useful. But then they figured out from the museums that they really wanted to get more content and get their images and be able to promote their exhibitions and do that through Google. So this is a timeline of the very earliest days of the Cultural Institute. I joined right after the V1 launch. So that was, like I said, the 17 museums. By the following April, so in about a year that we were there, I had worked with, there was a team of 3 of us full-time working on it, along with external contractors. We had set up the metadata schema and the tool that looked a lot like YouTube, for example, the YouTube uploader tool, where institutions could put their content, their images, any additional text and information back about their website. We grew that from 17 to 150 in about a year. And as you can see, within a couple of years, it was 400. And then now I'm not even sure, but I know it's well over 1,500 institutions that are participating. And they're doing all sorts of interesting and creative things around art selfies and other marketing projects, and trying to focus on different things, but not necessarily just the cultural institutions themselves, but rather marketing them through Google infrastructure, which is kind of a necessary thing when you're building something that is a nonprofit sort of wedge in a larger company like this. Like, how do you sustain a project like this for 10 plus years when, you know, people are losing their jobs at YouTube and other parts of Google? Cultural Institute has actually maintained. So it's kind of interesting to think about. One of the most kind of mind-bending examples was when I was working specifically on the street view. So we would take a lot of interior photography. We would do shots outside as well. Anywhere that there were art sculptures and art parks and all sorts of places like that, there would be plenty of opportunities for the team to go. There were a couple of different technologies that we used. One was this backpack that we rapidly deployed in some cases. We were based in London and Paris, and this is one of my colleagues walking around temporary Banksy, trying to make sure that we had the photography in the system kind of fast enough so that, you know, when whoever it was that was going to take it down or move it, there was at least some record of it. Similarly, there's this cart. Some of this might be a little bit older. I mean, they've simplified things, but essentially this was some car batteries powering computers and lasers that we would walk up and down various cultural institutions and take photographs as they were going through it. They did it with drones as well. In the Guggenheim, you can fly up and down the rotunda in the Guggenheim, and also in the Palais here, you can also do the same thing where you can get shots from different heights and elevations. But this is also capturing and dealing with the vast amounts of data and geodata. The amount of time that we spent kind of tagging locations and in particular working with large amounts of content is really vast. Here, there was a lab in the Paris office that we built. The vast amount of content, again, was such that everyone was talking and thinking about large screens and large screen interactions, trying to figure out how to present all of this content that we were collecting from the institutions in the street view as well. So one of them was a large display wall that's still there in the Paris office that's being used for various demos.
I mentioned the gig.
Oh, please, yeah.
Yeah, can you go back? I mean, this is very much resembling your first slide, right? So
yeah.
This is a sort of 200,000-300,000 euro Christie's wall.
Yeah.
Just screens alone, not even talking about the machines behind it. So this is very much scaffold, one may say, because
exactly
people people may actually sit in front of a computer that costs 300 of it and do the exact same thing. So
Yeah.
do you have an idea like how much money and energy goes into the scaffold and how much actually goes into people using it?
It's probably 80-20, 80% scaffolding and 20% actual data research and development. I mean, in terms of collecting the content is only about 20% of the work. The reason, and money, like I said, the reality of it, and not to malign it in any way, just the reality of sustaining a project like that is it has to focus on on what a company like Google would find valuable in doing this kind of effort. And for them, it's about goodwill. It's about testing out technology that otherwise isn't available. For example, you did see the Taj Mahal. There was no other street view in India before the Cultural Institute came to do that photography. So if there's a good relationship with that, through that process, that's already a proof of concept for when the Street View fleet shows up and wants to do Street View in that country. Or perhaps there's a lot of money being spent in Paris because of EU reasons, or Brussels museums all of a sudden get a lot of attention because of the parliament being based in Brussels. And any number of kind of decisions are being made around the organizational scaffolding before even considering the technology and where we committed the technology. Even though a large chunk of the staff was based in London, all of the engineering resources were being deployed in France. So those kinds of decisions come up all the time. And when it came to this kind of screen, it was also about kind of attracting advertisers, partners, big launch events, promotion, which doesn't necessarily, on a scale that a lot of the partner institutions could never match. So, there's always that give and take. Yeah.
Thank you.
So just the visuals, the high resolution photography, this is something else that everybody was fixated on, that you could go from an image like this to seeing the brush strokes and the cracks and all the rest of it, but without necessarily asking a lot of the questions about what was the purpose necessarily behind it, or what was the scholarly or the cultural benefit of doing it. Again, just opening the question, not necessarily asking for any debate there. It's more just we did it because we could, and that was kind of enough. Some of the interesting things, absolutely, we found were connections across the institutions, where something from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, in this case, along with the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, we found these connections that the institutions didn't know they had necessarily, or from the Morgan Library and the Van Gogh Museum, being able to find sketches of early Van Goghs and things like that. But some other interesting aspects were having to blur in Street View. So for copyright reasons or security or other kinds of reasons, as we were going through the institutions, we would have to blur out the paintings the same way that you blur out faces or license plate numbers in Street View. We had to do it for copyright reasons of here. An intrepid set of artists went through and found where it was that we had blurred and the objects that we had blurred. They took screenshots of those images and then sent them to Chinese factory painters, meaning either people who would paint them by hand or use 3D printers, essentially, to put ink on canvas, to generate the objects that we had blurred out, so that it would be as if that was the actual object. So that object that didn't exist, that went from painting to blurred image, would then become a 3D thing that someone could potentially buy. Was kind of an interesting kind of circle that we noticed early on. But it was hilarious in some cases, where the sculpture that it was in a room could be shown, but none of the images, but the building, the institution still wanted that particular space to be shown. Or everything in this MoMA atrium shot had to be blurred except for the title of the installation and the title of the exhibition. So again, as you walk around, it's kind of interesting what the value of and the purpose of a project like this then becomes. Another interesting, the last one that I wanted to focus on is whenever there's a technical glitch. and this was something that came up a lot, is that these images were approved, but these could never exist. I mean, these abstract op art works could never physically exist, but because of the glitch, as you're walking through the institution, this is what you're actually seeing. So it's kind of an interesting extension there as well. After Google, I ended up at Ithaca. Family kind of brought me back to the US. Like I said, I was based in London and in Paris. And JSTOR and Artstor, I'm hoping some of you are familiar with both of those, but JSTOR is the more well-known. It's a collection of 20 million or so humanities and social science articles. And Artstor, also a large repository at this point, 12 million plus images from lots and lots of different collections, public and private collections, both, that are focused, trying to find the highest quality images, and especially getting around those copyright issues. So what's distinctive about Artstor is that they have access to content that is under copyright because it's for educational use. And the institutions feel more comfortable sharing that material in that way. What is interesting, though, is when we started looking at the data. So there's more data present in one record as opposed to another. But what exactly made it a good record versus a bad record? So we talk about completeness as if it's always a good thing, or if there's more information in a given field, that's always a good thing, or something to that effect. Once you start considering the user of that information in a different way and the kinds of things that they're actually doing with that, does that score work globally across the entire collection, or is it only for a specific local use or a specific local collection? Is it appropriate that there's lots of subjects within the description from one institution as opposed to the entire collection? Generally, because of the way search works, whether it be Solr, Elasticsearch, or anything else that you tend to be using, the more text you have, the more likely the content is to appear. But whether or not that's a relevance or ranking or recall question is really what's compelling, like whether or not people are finding that information valuable. So I started looking at incoming metadata collections. One of the projects that we had worked on was collecting things from not just journals, but also looking at primary sources. So newspaper archives, special collections at university libraries, bringing all of that material online alongside the secondary literature, so that if you're doing a search on a particular topic, you would also have primary sources in addition to those secondary sources. But the metadata that was there, obviously, as we've talked about, and I think is going to keep coming up, had lots of gaps. So the format tended to be consistent, but the reasons for those gaps and why the gaps were there were sometimes just as important as what was present in the data. So was it something as simple as two different kinds of objects are being uploaded? Let's say it's a collection of stamps and a collection of coins. If it's all in one data sheet, obviously there's going to be a gap when you're talking about the back of one talks about the back of a coin. The stamp generally doesn't have anything on the back, so that is always going to be empty. Or was it a different data standard being applied at different times? Were they being filled out by a different group of people or a different department that didn't find that particular column valuable or that particular piece of information valuable? So when we were looking at the different types of information, this is something, the first place that we had to do some clustering was looking at all of the different columns that were present in the different metadata files that were being uploaded, and trying to figure out, when one person talks about notes, is that the same thing as writes notes? Can we say that if there's a notes field, does it have the same sort of content that's present in writes notes, or what differences are there? Same thing with description or creator or any of these. How can we start sorting these into nearby records and things that should be filled in but haven't been filled in, meaning which ones are actually missing data, like predominantly, versus ones that are intentionally left blank. The other aspect that we kind of, in a naive approach, was looking at diversity of values within a given column. So how informative would it be that a repository value is always present, but it's always the same? Versus the creator, if it's always the same creator, if somebody types in and searches for something by that creator, they're only going to get those results back, but they're not necessarily, there's no differentiation between that and any other record that has that creator name. So one of the things that we were looking at was how diversity within a given vocabulary for a column or a particular data field would be a good mechanism for trying to figure out whether or not it's a good record or a bad record. And one of the ways we did scoring was just a simple fuzzy text match across all of the, how far away is the text of any given value from the entire vocabulary that's present in that set or in that column. So I'm just laughing because, of course, this is a library called Fuzzy Wuzzy. And you just do a fuzz ratio, looking at the two different words, and depending on how you do it. So the things that are the most, the metadata URL in this case, the numbers don't matter, but just the ordering of the columns in this case, or the results. The title, the creator, the subject, the description, and so on. But things like display date, language, OCLC number in this case was always blank or always the same. So that's why it's coming back as a 0. Trying to figure out which columns are the most important for that collection, and trying to figure out at scale, at a large enough collection scale, how can we actually start doing this in an automated way? It's increasingly abstracting it away from the content and increasingly abstracting it away from the specifics of any given collection or how it got there, but to try to find a way to work for 20 million objects that could also, again, satisfy the search criteria and the way that search works and the website works. We were trying to find ways that made sense for everything. This is a quick view of what the output of something like that looked like. So each one of these rows is just a cluster of records. So what this means is there's 78 that had the metadata URL, the local name, the local name, the title, the creator, and so on, all of those filled in. And then there's another 3 that are this is rank ordered by how well they scored. And what we started noticing is that these particular, it was starting to get easier to find records that should have clustered with something else except for a given field. So in this bottom set, for example, the description's missing or the creator's missing from a few others. And adding the creator back or filling in the description field would automatically promote them to a different cluster. And that was a pretty effective way of suggesting where to remediate our metadata. So we didn't have to spend thousands, tens of thousands of hours and dollars, improving the metadata that wouldn't necessarily be used by anybody, but rather focusing on the metadata that was going to be the most informative and the most impactful that we actually saw on the website. So another way that we went about it.
If you ask a question in between?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so this is a rather interesting sort of affair, right? Because it actually harks back into this thing that there is people in institutions like you who have an insight into the data that other people don't have. Yeah. And if you make these decisions, obviously it's difficult because there will be data that will be quote unquote be left behind, right? As George W. said. But the key thing is there is a more fundamental notion, which I think is quite interesting, which is that at this moment, when you don't think about the data set anymore in this sort of content categories, like you're not a stamp specialist or a coin specialist or a, I don't know, Alexander the Great coin specialist or whatever, but you think about the topology or the geometry of the whole thing, basically. And that I think is utterly fascinating because through another door, this also is coming into cultural analytics and digital humanities completely different way as people embed stuff in machine learning there's a different form of topology and geometry going on. So in some sense, how do you, like, one thing that would interest me is, like, obviously, we know each other because we met each other in a circumstance where somebody, namely the Gettys, invited 5 people or 4 people who were in that space, who would like spend 5 days in a room and actually talk to each other. But did you encounter a sort of crowd of people that do what you're doing in this way? Or is that something where you would say, oh yeah, that exists in industry, it exists in Amazon, it exists in Thomson Reuters, but in the cultural field, it's pretty lonely.
I think the people in cultural industry, whether it be institutions, like so museums, libraries, archives, I think everyone thinks about it in this way, but not many have the technical skills to interrogate their collections in the way that a Google or an Amazon or a Reuters could. That's the big distinction. That there's only maybe 5 or 6 museums that I can think of off the top of my head anyway that have the technical staff and the engineering staff that have the time to dig into their data deeply enough that they can really kind of not just know that these things are there. Like, to our experience, we were generating a lot of insights that we showed them to the curators, and they were like, well, yeah, obviously. That they felt as if they already knew this. And of course they did, because they had a different lens on it. It's just we were naively coming at it from the technology side. Similarly, at the cultural institutions, I think a lot of the curators, a lot of the data maintainers, the people who actually maintain the collections database, they know it, but they can't back it up with any kind of analytics or numbers or ways to improve or tune it in any systematic way. That's I think what's missing. That the infrastructure for data understanding at this scale and for acknowledging the strange trajectories of data that spans 100, 1,000, 10,000 years is still something that they don't have.
Super. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite images from Artstor that I had come about recently, before I left anyway, when we started looking at images in particular, and how do we get images and text to start working well together. Somebody at the University of Pennsylvania thought it was important enough to upload, but it's an unknown image with an unknown title with an unknown subject. Still don't know who he is, but he's not very happy. We realized that search needs more text, obviously. That because of the fact that there was very little text in this case, this image would rarely come up, but at the same time, it kept filling. These are the kinds of things that would keep filling up our queue. People would have to spend time processing it. We would have to spend time hosting it, and storage and processing time and all the rest of it would have to be spent on maintaining this material. And nonprofit though JSTOR is, there still has to be a focus on some sort of efficiency. So what else do we do it? What else do we do with information like this or with images like this? And this, of course, I'm hoping most of you are familiar with this kind of approach, but solving it at scale, you tag a lot of images and you match incoming images against those tags. And hopefully those models have a good enough set of that content so that you can get informative tags back from that. What I was focused on specifically was 2 of the values, meaning the recall and the relevance, right? So with recall, is it going to show up in search at all? So previously we had that gentleman who was untitled, very unlikely that he was going to show up in anybody's search. If we give him any additional tags, even poofy hair and wearing a suit and all the rest and having a tie, at least he would come up in those searches if anyone would ever search for those terms. And then relevance, basically looking at whether or not, if anyone were to see that image in a result set, would they click on that thinking that it is actually relevant to their search? So that is it related to that topic? How well is it related to that topic? And maybe not just globally semantically, but rather specifically to this use. Like in this archive, when I'm looking for this topic, when I'm doing research on X, and I see this image, am I going to click on this image? Am I going to use this image? So I looked at 3 different, and this was maybe a few months before all of the LLMs and GPTs and of the world kind of exploded. But I was looking specifically at some of the vision services that were present. So that's why you don't see any of the GPTs here. But Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, I went through all 3 of their API services and put up how much essentially they cost for us to go through. And you can test your APIs with a few hundred, a few thousand images. There's additional costs if you're doing storage, but just to give everyone a sense of how much this kind of project costs, depending on how many millions of images that you're running through them, it's really in expenses for a large nonprofit or any kind of for-profit company. A few million images is really not a lot of money, depending on what it is that you're going to end up doing with it. So it's never about the actual images themselves. It's about how much time and effort. This tends to be the easiest part of the process. It's more about processing the information that you collect after. So initially, I did a very small experiment. The way that I kind of validated the approach was looking at the Wellcome collection. The Wellcome, it's a large primarily science institution based in London, but they also have a huge image archive of all sorts of kind of vernacular and ephemeral kind of content. Everything from maps and posters and prints and everything else. So what I did was I asked Mechanical Turkers to tag all of the content and come back with tags. So I had human naive tags. I didn't want subject matter experts necessarily, because again, I was thinking, what if the algorithms weren't good enough and we needed to go back to naive experts or naive taggers? So I tagged it with Mechanical Turk, and then I also did it with those 3 APIs to test out and to collect as many tags as I could. At a glance, there were lots of tags that did come back. Google came back with about 2,000 different tags, Amazon about 2,000, Mechanical Turk, because of the way that I had it set up, was over 1,500 tags. That was great. But there were varying levels of detail, and for any given object, of course, there was a little bit of discrepancy between each one of them. So this is where it started getting a little bit more interesting, is if you looked at Google, 315 tags applied 2,000 times. And over on the right, you'll see the histograms for Google, Microsoft, and Amazon for their confidence scores. So Google's confidence, peaks out and then comes back down, but they don't really want to give you 100% because they're not super sure, but they're fine, but they won't give you anything below 50%. So that's pretty much what their curve is. If you look at Microsoft, for some reason, they only want to tell you 80% or more, but then below that, it'll still kind of show up, but it doesn't really like to give its confidence at that level. That threshold, I still don't quite understand where it comes from. Amazon, it has either it's very confident or very close to confidence, or it's spread out essentially. But the 3 different distribution sizes for confidence interval were completely a surprise to me. Also, the unique terms that were present in each one. So in Google's case, 219 of the terms were unique. In Microsoft, 65 of the terms showed up only in the Microsoft tag set, and the same thing with Amazon. What was interesting here is that the Microsoft language, and I'm not sure if anybody else has already used them, but Microsoft's vision services were the most generic and had the fewest number of terms, where Google was the most expansive. And Amazon was very clearly focused on shopping, that it was very much about tagging material and just the physical properties of whatever was on screen. So the vocabularies were so different across the 3 different setups. The kinds of tags recall, it definitely showed up a lot more. More images matched. So we had 14 million times that they showed up. They were those 2,000 terms across all of the different tags. They were present in 14 million of the image, and now they appear a total of 48 million times if we apply it to all of the content and so on. So that increases quite significantly. You do get more image results. So for the same 752 queries, you get in 4 million more images popping up in image results. That's great. that suggests at least that some of these images should have been coming up in the results, but weren't because they weren't tagged in a particular way. So we had to do some A/B testing. We started looking at whether or not we pulled out the tags. We finally applied them all back, and this is kind of the thing you can see. Tie, accessories. So, for example, in the one in the middle, you've got overcoat, clothing, coat, apparel, person. This is again Amazon. Blazer, jacket, fashion, home decor, attorney, and so on. And the kinds of terms that would be coming back. The interesting aspect that once we started looking at relevance is that this is on a A/B test across 2 weeks of normal JSTOR usage. So we had an image impression rate in the control segment that was 7.4%, which meant in a given search, whether or not images showed up, meaning there was an image that was of a high enough relevance to be presented, was 7% of the time. So if you did a particular search, then you saw any images, it was 7% of the time. That went up to 9.4% instead of 7.4%. Great, fantastic. The image interaction rate, however, went down from 7.75 down to 6.21. So ultimately, the total image views were about 52 more images being presented after all of this work of going through and tagging all of the content, going through the material. The end result was a fairly measly 52 additional images being viewed because, again, either they were so irrelevant or just not related to the particular topic that people were looking for. Overall, what's interesting is that 3.2% of overall JSTOR searches were part of the test. So that, again, the impact could be a lot larger. And we did tests that were more significant than this, but this is the kind of thing that we kept finding, is that if you just increase metadata or increase coverage or increase completeness, that alone isn't necessarily enough to change user behavior, and that what you think or what the algorithms might think are valid interpretations, even though they're spot on in some cases, that they're exactly what a person is searching for. There's so much nuance and additional kind of confounding factors in the interface to why a person would click on something or not click on something that would completely dominate any of the impact of metadata improvements in some cases.
You take a question?
Sure, please.
So, I mean, obviously there's a sort of like in annotation world, if you think about like 50 years ago, librarians would do 3 index cards per book, and they didn't get because the paper was expensive and space in the time. And now we're in a world where you can totally like sort of search the entire full text of the book. Like nothing hinders you putting the entire book inverted into your index. So basically, we could have 100% like all data is metadata, basically.
Yeah. So
then we're back to exactly where you are right now, right? Where you say, okay, what's actually bounding what we find? The shape, the whole information, the whole corpus, or is it sort of like your measurement instruments or the lens you're looking through, which is, as you said, your user interface? Did you take a look at these user interfaces too? Like how do people use that and stuff? So
yeah, no, quite a bit. I mean, there's nonstop A/B testing at at Google, of course. There was a lot of manipulation of how we would present the kind of content that we wanted people to go and visit and interact with. So that depended on, now if you go to the pages, honestly, most of them are those interactive experiments and a lot of the kind of more tailored, packaged sort of cultural experiences. So there was a tool for creating narrative specifically from one image to the next, adding video, telling stories. That's the kind of thing that's highlighted right now. And the actual content, meaning the images and all of the metadata and the photography and so on, all of that is usually a layer or two below that you have to click around a little bit to find that. because again, of the way that we wanted people to interact with it and where we wanted to drive traffic to what kind of content and to be able to show the impact of a particular marketing effort or a particular launch. That's, again, the reality there. From the JSTOR and Artstor side, it was very much about presentation. So image size, where it would show up. Would it be a carousel strip across the top of the journal results? Should it be included along the side of when you land on a particular journal or a particular article? Should it tell you the related results in a vertical format and include the images? Should it be a separate tab and kept separate from it? So how all of those had their pros and cons. So for example, if you had it as a separate tab, you knew that the intent of the person was a little bit stronger than someone just kind of scrolling past the images. You knew that they were looking for images related to that topic, not just the text. Or if it was across the top in the carousel, they were much more likely to see it, but whether or not they would click on it, that reduction went down quite a bit. So it had to do, and then that equated to the amount of time and effort that we would put into actually improving that particular kind of metadata. So absolutely, the interface that we're building, especially when it comes to this kind of scale, where JSTOR was a top 300, top 500 website in terms of traffic when they were still checking it. It is often a very, if not the first, then among the first research destinations for a lot of people at large universities. So there's a lot of traffic coming from those universities. And we had enough traffic to be able to do really robust A/B segmenting and trying out the different kinds of visual designs that we wanted to. So yeah, there's definitely an impact of the visual choices that you make before, that probably dominate any of these additional metadata characteristics. So one last, I think one that I wanted to show you is a little bit of a citation graph project that we worked on. And this actually brings me a little bit closer to what it is that I'll be working on at DataCite as well. So at full JSTOR content, at least at the time, there was about 32 million entities. That's roughly 18 million or so articles, and the rest were images largely. There were also some books in that collection as well. But we were trying to use Microsoft Academic Graph, Open Citation Network, some of the internal reference data we had at JSTOR as well. What you see over on the right is a completely, unintelligible but beautiful from a cultural analytics perspective, high degree JSTOR citation subgraph, where we tried to color in some of the clusters that we were starting to see and whether or not we could match those to different disciplines within JSTOR, subject categories that we had applied to that content. We did out of a pretty healthy structure, what we thought would be a healthy structure in terms of how many nodes and edges, and the internal matching of about 1 million nodes and edges. But the part that's kind of missing in this slide, and I thought about this and how intentional we were, maybe I might have presented it differently, is I said we had 32 million entities, and we're really happy about the fact that there's 1 million nodes that match. So what happened to the other 31 million? And where did all that content go? And whether or not the ones that have edges and the ones that have citations are the ones that are just going to start showing up more in search and in results. So we spent a lot of time looking at that, and that's exactly what, when I went back through the data and I started looking at it, it's primarily JSTOR articles that have complete data. We have the most data about them. And we only matched about 2 million of those to external IDs. So how many of those lived in Microsoft Academic Graph or any of the other A-minor or any of those other open science citation graphs? Does that mean that those other 12 million journal articles don't exist anywhere, or that they don't exist in any other citation database? Do we have 12 million articles that nobody else has processed? So that seemed like a little bit of a strange extension too. And then we had so many things like the multimedia, which primarily was images down here at the bottom. We had a lot of data, but again, the citation formats and the data formatting was such that we couldn't, it just wasn't possible to find, or at least not easily, using the techniques we were using to match those with external graph databases. So we kind of looked at where it was that we had the distinctive content. And again, if you look at the N in this first column, so this is the humanities, literature, and the arts, how many articles are present in a given, meaning the total N across all of these different citation graphs that were present. And out of those 89,000, 87% of them are present in Google Scholar, 39% in Microsoft Academic, and so on. But the N is so much smaller than it is in the health and medical sciences, for example. And we just don't have at JSTOR necessarily that health and medical sciences content. So even if we were already at a disadvantage in terms of building a citation graph using external sources, because nobody has really, or up until recently really, anyone has focused on the humanities or social sciences to collect the same depth of citation matching and has been done in other kind of hard sciences. And when we talk about internal citations, these were created, like you mentioned, the librarian with the note cards. Some of these were created by hand. We had a relationship with Crossref to go and check a particular citation placed in a paper. So you'd start with a particular tourism and livestock farming in the Spanish Pyrenees article. You would have a reference panel that had 34 references. And of those, a handful would already be recognized on Crossref that would also allow you to view those on JSTOR. So we had a set of those internal citations. And those were ones that were gold standard in the sense that there was a librarian on staff at some point during the processing of that article had made that connection and knew it was there. So out of a total, again, of that internal citation information, so there's 12.7 million articles at the time, we had 3.8 million that had citation information at all, and 1.2 million, so another 30% that had citation identifiers attached. And then from those, less than 1 million that had one citation pointing back to JSTOR, meaning if you were in JSTOR, whether or not you'd be pointed to something internal to JSTOR or you would be sent away. Again, JSTOR is not super interested or wasn't super interested in keeping people within just the JSTOR infrastructure. The whole point was to get value to the academic. So it's not as if we would only highlight those million, but that it's not nearly enough to justify 980,000 out of even that 12.7 million articles. That's going to be roughly how much time and effort the IT department or the engineering team is going to be wanting to spend on something that they know is not going to necessarily have a huge impact on user behavior or all the rest of it, because it's only going to be those 980,000 articles, which aren't necessarily the ones that people are going to go visit anyway. So this has nothing to do with usage or whether or not it's a popular article or anything else. It just so happens that those are the ones that had the citations pointing back that we could create that for internally. So that's again some of the ways that we would be considering a citation graph. So what I wanted to kind of open up the conversation, or I want to hear everybody's opinions about some of these projects and what you think about when you hear about how it is that I have to think about this from inside of institution, is when is there enough of this metadata and what is enough? So whether it's the slide that had the bit from the Metropolitan Museum where already the metadata starts getting fuzzy as soon as a cataloger starts putting information in? Or is it all about the pixels? And do we try to get high resolution of everything? Or what exactly does it mean when we have to start blurring physical reality and when we're creating digital surrogates of this content or missing data, and how it is that we ultimately test and see whether or not any of this is valuable? I'd love to hear kind of your responses and see where the conversation takes us.
Thank you very much. This is amazing. Okay, I got a very, very big question, but I don't want to ask it first, I guess. which is sort of the inverse of Piotr's question. Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll put it out.
Actually, I could say something. Hi, Piotr.
Hey.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was so exciting because I'm a PhD student here at Kudan. And we had our study where we used the museum's metadata. And I really felt your pain when you showed these tables with a lot of missing data or wrong dates or manually put dates. So yeah, you did a lot of work, you know, because we were working only with two fields: the date of the artist's death, the date of the artist's birth, the date of creation of an artwork, and the date of collection. But I can't imagine like what you had to go through, you know, to to make an order in all the cells, because obviously you need to show way more data, so to make all this information usable. On the other hand, I could see the difference when the museums were heavily understaffed, because some data sets were like in a very horrible state, and we had to manually improve it. And sometimes, like my colleague Mar, he even sent the data set back to the museum so they could use it. And they were grateful because the quality of the data was increased by 20%. And for example, in other cases, we had like the Denmark Museum data, when everything was so very well cataloged, and the information was so rich, and there were so many variables there. So you could obviously see that it's a work of a team. So I have a very practical question. Is it a secret? Can you tell us the names of these institutions with very good teams when
No,
they have?
not at all. No, of course. No. I think so. The first one that comes to mind is the Getty. The Getty in Los Angeles is incredible. I mean, just in terms of the amount of time they've put into their APIs and the vocabulary work that they've done with the TGN and even AAT. I mean, all of these really good vocabularies that they have. The metadata and the provenance index that they've been working on for a very long time, they've been spending as much money on their research side as they do on the collection side. So that's absolutely the first one that comes to mind. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, they have a large open collection of content. The amount of data they release is probably a lot less ultimately than what the Getty does, because of the history of the institution. It's been around so much longer. They have so many more skeletons literally in the closet with the metadata, because the difficulty is there was a project that was trying to show all of the historical labels that were present on an object. You could imagine some of the complicated relationships the curators have with the language that was being used in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s to describe an artwork, that modern audiences would not use those terms or those words. Even though all of that is available, they don't want to have that argument and they don't want to have that conversation. So they just ignore, you know, piles of content and so much wonderful information that's back there. Indianapolis Museum had a lot of really good material. Dallas used to have a lot of good content. Parts of the Smithsonian. I mean, I can come down with the list. Brooklyn Museum has a lot of, they were one of the first that did a lot of the material around the APIs. There's some cultural institutions you might not expect, like the Australian Center for the Moving Image. This has a lot to do with the people that work at these museums. So in that case, it's a gentleman by the name of Sebastian Chan. He's been bouncing around different museums, and everywhere he goes, he keeps improving the metadata. And he ended up now, he's the director at that museum, where he's been, you know, doing some projects like that. So there's definitely pockets, and I can definitely share a longer list, but they're the ones that are trying to do the most with their open data. There's the Crystal Bridges Museum, for example, in the US. Again, a very new museum founded by the family who has all the Walmart money. They wanted to focus on American art primarily, but because they were building a new collection, they could build the metadata and build their collections information from scratch. So they're also involved in a lot of information sharing projects like that. So yeah, there's internationally, I would say, even though lately they've had a lot of trouble, is the British Museum. They have a lot of metadata for objects, but the trouble that they've run into is that they have such a large collection and such a long history, is that when you start, you just don't know where it ends. Like for some of their collections and some of their departments, they're beautifully cataloged, but other ones, you know, people can take things out of the museum and nobody notices because there's so much stuff. And that's what you run into. So it's like you've got a balance sometimes. But definitely it's not so much a secret. It's just you try to find the institutions that have a large enough technical staff and an education staff too. The education department is also very important because they're the ones that try to actually use internally a lot of that metadata to say things about the collection. So I'd focus on those two departments.
Oh, that's amazing. You're doing incredible work. And it's very useful for us as well, because right now we're expanding our study and we hope to have only Dallas Museum and Metropolitan Museum data. So now I think that's where to go first.
Yale and Harvard too, as far as universities. Yale and Harvard have really great open collection data.
Oh, amazing. Good. Because we have Carnegie Museum, I think. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Very useful.
Thank you very much. I'd like to add a little bit, which is quite interesting, because I think there's an opportunity of, we're coming from basically different continents, and the institutions that would come to your mind and to my mind at the top are the same, but then as you go down the list, it's obviously depending on the experience. And I think what is interesting regarding the Getty case in particular is that these vocabularies are actually decidedly used outside of art history. Like the art and architectural thesaurus, despite its name, has been used by a lot of projects, including by Los Alamos and whatever. And in a similar way, it is actually really, really worthwhile to look at like the data that you're using, no matter where you are, and see where that comes from. Like, for example, the FIEF data of the German National Library, which is sort of the variant name norm data for persons, that is sort of internationally used. The greatest contributor is actually a union catalog of 3 art libraries. This is quite curious, right? Because it's not like the art libraries are sort of like the people who sort of like document the most important people, but they just do it systematically. So Central Institute for Art History, Max Planck in Florence and Rome, they actually collect these names and then they create the identifier, and then people start talking about this. And this can happen in these large places, which are, you know, supremely funded, that, you know, Piotr had mentioned a bunch of them, but it also can happen for specific cases in specific areas if there is an interest. And so this is sort of something, never underestimate a small institution, right? Like, for example, I work with Glyptothek in Munich, which only has 500 sculptures, but they're some of the best in the world, and obviously the data is really good. But it's only 500 pieces. The same is true for things that are bespoke, like the Eamon Carter Museum, for example, in Fort Worth, which focuses on American art, has an absolutely fantastic library because it's also funded by donor money, similar to the Getty's. And they have fantastic librarians who could tell you sort of like a lot of like different things and sort of like really do these deep dives and sort of like bring together data that's, you know, just requires a lot of money to do. And I think that is sort of like a really interesting thing, that while at the one hand, we live in a world where in digital humanities project, we talk about the same institutions all the time, right? That has to do with, it's a small crowd, there's an American crowd, there's a German crowd, there's a British crowd, there's a French crowd. The French, you know, Beatrice Choyer-Prumel, which we had a couple of weeks ago, would be here, where it's like, so Piotr and Max, what are you talking about? You haven't talked about Chacon and about the French National Library, like all that kind of stuff. So to every country you go, you can find something rather similar. And I think we're sort of like, we're stuck in the situation that there's a lot of data we don't see because we don't know where the awesome people sit. So I'm saying
it's very, no, it's compelling. The SM, what was it? SMK in Denmark, Rijksmuseum, obviously, in terms of, absolutely. There's all sorts of pockets of well-funded, but also what we noticed from the Google case was if we showed up at a large museum, they were able to take advantage of what it is we had to offer. If we showed up at a very small museum, my favorite one was the Pigeon Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. incredible history of pigeons across, like show pigeons, like, you know, anyway, look it up. It's fantastic. But the on one side, and then they had so much material and they cared about it so much that they cataloged it so incredibly. But again, like you said, a very niche and a very specific thing. But it was the ones in the middle, the ones that have difficulty with their budgets just keeping the doors open or keeping the lights on, that those are the institutions that really had the most difficulty in their metadata. So
Mila.
we've got other questions, please.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, I'm kind of like, I can really relate to like the problems of doing queries and searching data, and simultaneously with the kind of like when is it enough? Because you know, we can always wish for more and for more detailed information and so on. My background is in cultural history, and I often, when I start using some new database or doing queries, I think that it's really puzzling to, you know, it takes a lot of time to find what are the correct search words, of course, to find anything useful there. Now that I have been so I have been, for instance, working with newsreel data from the Soviet Union and from Estonia, and I think that it's what is really interesting to me is kind of like one of the findings that I have realized when I have been working with my own data is that actually gaps in the metadata can be also very informative. They, you know, they can, of course, you know, you need to somehow dig deeper to understand what makes these gaps, whether it's that we don't know this, or it's gone missing, the information, or it has been removed for some reason, or, you know, whatever the reasons are. But I just kind of like as a reflection to your like the last question that you had, that when is it enough and what is enough? So because I think that you know, we can always ask for more. So have you been ever having kind of like conversations whether we could somehow use these kind of like visualize the structures of the data, and also to look at these gaps, because somehow gaps of information can be also useful, and they can be also sometimes even kind of like basis of queries as well. So I definitely want all the, I don't know, all the information, all the data that is missing, I don't know, some values there. So I wanted to maybe you to reflect
it's
a little bit about
definitely
this.
it's something that comes up. The trouble is that the logic becomes more complicated because you're trying to prove something's a negation by its absence, right? You're like saying that this should be there, but it's not. And you're kind of starting with that assumption to some degree. What I've seen done and what I've done in the past is that if you look at, you need to start with your set of keywords, and then you move them over to another vocabulary. Either you go up a level in the taxonomy, or and you look for all of the related terms that are present there. So the way, for example, there's the JSTOR thesaurus. I'll give you an example. There's the JSTOR thesaurus, and then there's the Library of Congress subject headings. You have a particular set, maybe 3 tags, but you feel as if it should also include these other 2 tags. Why are they not present? What we had done is we take those the 3 tags that are present from the JSTOR thesaurus, we match them to the Library of Congress thesaurus, and we look at the cluster in the Library of Congress and say, these are all the terms that we would imagine would be present in that. And then we look at the relationship between where is this term appear and where do we find these other terms appearing. And because of that, we say, hey, there's probably these other terms that should have been applied to this content because these 3 words show up, this 4th and 5th additional term tend to show up with these terms and other vocabularies. Why are they not showing up here? So you have to, but it's at that point, you have an argument, but whether or not it's an argument that is present because of anybody's omission, or whether or not it's purely there was only room to enter 3 vocabulary terms in the interface. Maybe it was something as simple as that, or that the people entering, did it alphabetically, and these were the first 3 terms that that were available. I mean, that there's any number of these confounding factors that you have to consider, the labor and the practices that went into generating that metadata. So I don't envy the difficulty, but I think there are automated methods that you could use to start pointing out that we would expect that these terms should appear. Why they don't appear, that is the reason that we need a PhD.
Thank you. Last comment.
Hello. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I also see that
Thank
you have passed to some places I've been also. I've been in Banff working for a little while. One thing is that Antonina explained, like, this our project that we look at the collection lag in the museums, basically the time that passed between an artwork was produced to being collected by museums. We had a lot of well, one was cleaning the data. That was like definitely a hassle. But the other is the reaction of some museums. Like I can mention some, for example, Guggenheim sent us a very kind of a rude email saying that no, we are gonna not share, even they have an API, we are not gonna share the entire collection to you. And we still don't understand. They were saying that their data was not precise. But then we are actually using very, like Antonina said, very concrete fields where it should be kind of precise, because like the year that they acquire, or the year where an artist born or dead, and the year where this art was produced. That's very straightforward fields. But we still don't know why they don't want to share. I still have a missing email to Bilbao. I'm originally from Barcelona, and as you know, in Bilbao, they always because Guggenheim is a franchise, they always put as a success rate the Bilbao one, and like this, they had solved many other cases where the not has been so successful as Bilbao as a city transformation with a museum. But they use tons of public money, means by actually European standards, they should share their collection just with Bilbao. I still need to send an email to the Bilbao people. But yeah, we have some frictions with some museums especially because I think that they're not used to receive this sort of kind of more computational studies, that they want the entire collection. And there, I think they were, even we had a workshop one that they said at the beginning yes, and after they said no. And we are very flexible, because like sometimes they say we don't have everything digitalized. There's no problem. That's what, if you have not everything digitalized, we use just the part that is digitalized, as that's the only part that can be studied at the moment. Means we explain our method, and that we do it in this way, and should be no problem, because that's I mean, if the art is in boxes and had not been put in the database, no, it's like it doesn't exist at the moment. In 20 years when they finish, then can be studied, right? But what we can do otherwise. Yeah, what is your kind of, as an expert, what's your opinion about what I explained? Because we had very surprises about in this project. I mean, one is the obvious problem of the cleaning the data and different formats and so on, but the resistance of some museums has been for us quite like a shock sometimes. Like
yeah, I mean, you're running into the realities of the museum world, specifically around and the Guggenheim is a wonderful institution for anyone listening, but also very difficult to work with, because they have so many living artists or recently deceased artists in some cases, and the provenance and the specific histories of how an artwork gets into a museum collection is some of the most closely guarded information that you could possibly ever ask for. So you picked a hard institution and a hard question to solve. If you were to focus on, you know, a topic where there was a lot less money involved and a lot fewer powerful people involved, I think you might have had an easier time getting the metadata. Is probably the easiest way to put it, because the museums are interested in, to some degree. I mean, how many, you know, to be honest, look at where do a lot of artworks come from? How do they end up in museums? They end up there for tax reasons. They end up there for, you know, bequests, any number of financial relationships that are between the institution and ultimately galleries that are going to be buying and selling that work if it ever leaves the museum. For them to expose a lot of potentially personal or private collections information that seems like such a simple thing, like when was it made? If it's not that easy. Or it's, you know, who owned it, or when was it acquired? Well, who, you know, how did it come to the museum? You know, all of those get very, very complicated for the institution to answer. So of those, I showed a table that was very easy to show, but there were plenty of tables that were much more complicated and had, you know, even though the museum might know the specific history of the object, they wouldn't want that information to become public. So yeah, you might have a better chance with 500-year-old statues than you would with 100-year-old paintings, you know?
So,
Yeah, I mean, we know that, but although I think this is also depends of kind of the philosophy of the institution, because like
Oh yeah.
MoMA receives donations all the time, and I'm actually, in fact, I'm an artist, and I know people who is in MoMA, and I know how it works. I know that they ask donations to the galleries that they represent before they have a show, and so on. There is the one Estonian artist that is in MoMA was in there. I know it's like this.
Yeah.
But and other museums operate in this way, but it seems that the transparency issue is not the same everywhere.
No.
I think even it's like this, that there is this kind of things, to be honest, for transparency of market, it should be open, to be honest, because well, so, I mean, because I mean, in the field, I know what inside things on the field, and I told you that people who move a lot of money and they do it in art, because as I don't know if everyone had told before, it's just the last unregulated market that exists.
Yeah.
You can have the monopoly of 900 Andy Warhols, like Foundation of Warhol has, and you still can manipulate the price of it. And it's known. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's nothing that is not known. Like whenever the Sotheby's or Christie's is gonna sell a Warhol, they have an under ceiling price that they will call certain people to back up the price that never goes down until certain much, because they own so much of that. I mean, why they will go lower in certain price? Because they're kind of assets that would have to change the books of accounting, and they have the means to keep the price up. Means they do it. But
The other simple part is just, again, to the degree that we've been talking about before, there might not be anything nearly as complicated as they don't want to have to do this moving forward for all their objects, or go back historically for all of that content. There's a lot of research that has to go in, as we all know, into answering some of those questions. So it could be something much simpler and less kind of nefarious than dealing with this economic aspect. I do think the economic aspect has a lot to do with it. If your request ever made it to a press officer or a financial officer at the institution, or a lawyer at the museum, I'm sure they were concerned about that primarily. If it made it to a data person, the data person would immediately be like, well, we only have it for 5% of our works, or we only have that information, like concrete information, for a smaller percentage. So do we want to expose the fact that we only have 5% of our records? Again, that's one of the ways that the British Museum problem came up, is because they were so vast, they didn't have to necessarily talk about completeness. And if they don't have 100% coverage, then that's where gaps are, you know, and you can have these discrepancies that last for hundreds of years. So it's not going to be an easy collecting information about those fields in particular. Also a very hard one.
In fact, to finish, like what interesting in our project is, and especially in the new round that we are doing, that we are looking around the world, is actually see different strategies in the world, because like it's not in every country. In Europe, there is no tax breaks for collecting, giving to the art museum, rather in America there is. And this kind of changes is what we are looking at now, because that changed a lot. I mean, some of these tax breaks sometimes are to more younger artists, because they buy they buy faster because it's cheaper, and then they donate when they have more name, and then the withdrawal is bigger, and these kind of things. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it was very,
of course, thank you.
So I may add like some comment, which I think, Piotr, I would be very curious about your reaction. So this project, this museum collection lag project, came out of a class like 1.5 years ago. And there's a first paper out, which just, they won a sort of like best student paper award here at Tallinn University. And the key thing is, at the moment, they're working with 25 museums. Okay, so you know that, right? Like if you, like imagine somebody walks up to you and says like, I wanted a project and I'll look at like comprehensive collection scale data. I only want to have 3 data fields of 25 museums worldwide. And I need to collect the data. You know exactly what the reaction would be. It was like, no, let's not do that. That's like way too crazy. And so in some sense, we also had the discussion about what you were talking about, saying, okay, actually this contemporary data is more difficult than sort of like if you look at old sculptures, like literally. But at the same time, you know, you can argue that for contemporary art, your dating is probably more bounded. So you know at least a year. For most cases, for some you don't. Because artists also sort of like consciously obfuscated and stuff like that. But it's sort of easier than for, I don't know, stuff in the medieval ages, say. While at the same time, you got this copyright thing, which we could get around because we don't need the image. We literally only need these 3 numbers. But at the same time, there is a thing which I think is quite important here. So we're very consciously not engaging in data integration, which is what your job was like all the time. Like we don't want to integrate the data. We actually want to clean the data and actually look at it side by side. That is one thing. And then the other thing that we are doing is actually not waiting for the data to be more complete. And I think that is a really, really important thing. We're looking at the landscape as is. And if the landscape is shabby, like, you know, let's use that. Let's sort of like document that and even look at like, you know, if a museum only has 5% of the data, it's interesting to see if it still has the same structure. Will it have the same structure when we have 95% or 100% of the data? That would be a really interesting question. And these kind of things, there are day-to-day business in biology. People do 5% papers about anything. And then they do 25 and the 85 and the 100% kind of paper. But they don't, you know, they don't say, oh no, let's wait till the very end before we do analysis. Actually, in fact, we should do the analysis right now, because before we wrestle the octopus to integrate the data, we should know what we're actually wrestling, because that's when it's not so clear. So the cool thing, all this data preparation and ancillary stuff in this project, I don't know how conscious Antonina and Mark, you both were about this. This is the actual research. You basically found out what the museum landscape looks like. How does it behave? What do people do? And of course, if a museum has I don't know, 400 million Van Gogh in the photography department, usually they don't care about very, very little other than this one painting that is on the table without protection. While other, you know, museums have 10,000 objects in the vitrine and they don't care about it, and you can totally count and whatever. So there's this kind of like really interesting thing that we are looking at the museum from a different side. Now, here's a thing which I think is quite interesting. On the very qualitative end, where we can't do that, we are very much not doing what you're doing, Piotr. Like here we are in between in cultural data analytics. We deal with large data sets, we prepare and clean them up and enrich them and stuff like that. So we're doing a little bit of data integration. While at the same time, we also sort of look around. And I think there is these two extremes where one could say, if you're in this position where I have also been, like where we look at, we work with an institution, we have a large data set, we enrich it with like large scale metadata. We're a lot more like sitting in a fixed position and wrestling a huge octopus that, sort of like as we look at it, changes in like what we think it is and stuff like that. While as humanists, on the other hand, if I go to the library is the static thing. The books are in shelves and I'm the octopus. Like literally, I had this in my CV, Erasmus of Rotterdam, Polypi mentum obtine, take the mind of the polyp, of the octopus. So you basically want to sort of like take the shape of the rock you're sitting on in order to look at the material in as many different perspectives as possible. We can scale this up. We have just done this in the Newsreel framework paper, which the preprint is out and sort of is preliminary being accepted, where we basically do the same thing at a quantitative level. But the problem is indeed, how does the dance work if you do this really systematically? Can we adopt your position where we sort of like deal with the sort of giant octopus, while at the same time still have the agility of the humanist, having like many different sort of like perspectives? Like what would be a systematic way of looking at the octopus? Like, is there certain things you always do? And is there certain things which you think they're completely optional, you don't need to do them, basically?
I think the systematic aspect honestly started when I'll just talk about my own specific approach to the octopus and why it is that I feel more comfortable starting big and then going small now. So at the Met, I was trying to find the other slide. Maybe I'll be able to find it, but when it was just one museum and it was 17 departments that I was working with, I looked at those 17 departments in as many different visual slices as I could with that database view. And what made me feel confident when scaling whatever project I was working on was when I started seeing patterns across those departments. That I understood that even though this was arms and armor, and this was American paintings, and this was European paintings, and this was the medieval collection up at the cloisters, that the patterns in the data, meaning the number of fields that were being filled out and how many gaps there were and those kinds of things, that it was similar enough across within the context of a single institution. That's when I felt confident that I could scale it, that I could say that I'm going to make a project that's going to work across all of our data. So I kind of looked at every, tentacle of the octopus in more detail before trying to then make something bigger. Now, because I don't have the privilege of looking at each of those 17 million articles or looking into every disciplinary, subheading within JSTOR or something like that, I start at that top level. And then I try to figure out whether or not there are any kind of anomalies that I see in any one of those tentacles, to see if whether or not that entire octopus still looks like an octopus. So I think there is a way to both bottom up and top down this aspect of it, but I only feel confident doing the top down methods now after doing enough of that bottom up analysis. So that's why I do like going at the 3 different data fields, or going at a specific institution or a specific collection or something like that, and understanding what it is, what the fingerprints of that would look like, and where you could really identify what is strange or what is unique or aberrant about a particular collection. And at that point, you can start making assumptions that can scale up. The visualizations that I was looking at in particular were looking at date fields, honestly, within the collection, and when large acquisitions. This was American sculpture. I'll share the slide afterwards, but essentially it was block diagrams looking at over the course of history of a given department. Why is it that all of the things made out of bronze were acquired in this 20-year period? And it was because a certain artist that was working in bronze was being acquired. And, you know, even though their work spread a larger period, that particular artist's work became available. And looking at how that pattern spread out. Well, was that pattern kind of systematic across other media? Was it systematic across other artists? You know, asking those kinds of questions at the micro scale, that let you having enough of those examples were enough to kind of start making up classes or families, or, you know, understanding that this is what it should look like. Because if you don't have enough of those micro experiments, you don't know when you've made a completely radical, you know, departure at that macro scale. So it's purely by going through enough of these small data sets, I think, is where I would really start, and what I think is valuable about this kind of research group and this kind of project. So I hope that answered the question kind of vaguely.
Yeah. As there is no hands up right now, like it's a good moment to enter the big question I had. So you said, like, when is enough? When is it enough?
Yeah.
What is enough? So from the 1990s onward, right? Like, let's go back to the Gettys. The census of antique works of art and architecture known in the Renaissance was funded with hundreds of thousands of dollars by the Gettys, like every year, I think 100K, if they would add a certain number of records. Which obviously you know where this led to, right? So obviously there is a disincentive of reducing the number of records, for example, by recognizing, oh, these 3 drawings show the same Hercules, so I actually can reduce the 3 Herculeses to 1. So I only got 4 records instead of 6. Oh wait, I get less money if I do that. So that kind of stuff is sort of a really interesting. So back in the 90s, they had the idea that, yeah, you need to conform to standards, but then more is good. Okay, obviously, as you still digitize lots of stuff, this is sort of like a good notion, but then the question is, now we have more, what does it even mean? And so there is the big other question that's sort of like not saying, oh, when is enough enough? It's like, I think it can be more existentially, where it's like, why anyway do we annotate and tag data with metadata? Why do we use digital humanities methods to create, I don't know, standard markup of text in TI format? Why do we use artificial intelligence to sort of like give descriptions of every paintings and stuff like that? Like, why should we do that in the first place? So what could be the criteria? Why should we add more data to the data that is already there? And why, where is the end? I think it's indeed a very, 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 very good question. And I do think, I don't know if you look at my, like whatever I've done the last 20 years, one answer is obviously emerging complexity. So you can actually get out something from the data, which otherwise you wouldn't get out. Like, you need to look at large amounts of data and stuff like that. And as you look at complexity, there will be moments where you know enough, where everything in addition will tell you basically the same thing as your patterns you just said. But I don't have the feeling that this has in any way or form arrived in the humanities craft and funding. If you make that argument, you have to explain complexity science from scratch, essentially. And more is still better. So how do we deal with that? Like, how do we turn in the same way as biology has turned, which, by the way, started the same way. Chemistry has started the same way. They have counted stuff like molecules and articles and citations, and right now they do this systematically, and it's by all intents and purposes a complexity science. So we have not arrived there, but you are familiar with data. There's complexity everywhere. Like, what's your like? Can you speak a little bit to the conversations behind the scenes when somebody walks up to you, like the director of a museum or the head of Artstor, say, you know, you need to do X, Y, Z because, like, what is coming after the because in that sentence?
Well, I mean, in the nonprofit world, at the JSTOR Artstor side of the house, it's still about the value that you can provide to the partner institutions, because the economic motivations and the hard sciences are a little bit different than what you would find at those nonprofits. So they're all struggling for funding, and they're all struggling to show impact, whatever impact happens to be, whether it be number of articles published, number of times the data set was used, number of times an image or a research from a scholar at your institution was cited. All of those things are because of the funding cycles, because of grants, because of looking for additional kind of donations and other kinds of projects. Those are particularly important. So anything that can highlight the impact of shared collections, or in the case of JSTOR or Artstor, that people are coming to look at the content. That's the reason why we were looking at tagging, why we were looking at image recognition, that we were looking at citation graphs, to kind of drive more authentic usage of that material. Because and we talked about this before, that a lot of the behavior that you find in cultural repositories tend to be spear phishing. You come from a Google result, you see it, you click on it, you jump right in, you grab your PDF and you jump back out. So you just pop in and pop out. That's all you do. And for that, the argument is anti more data. It's do just enough to show up in the Google search results, and that's it. Like, that's all you need to do. The argument for more data is to give deeper analysis and deeper kind of opportunities for the people who care about a particular topic or need more information about that topic to be able to find it. So the missing keywords or the missing data is particularly important, because those are the people who are already looking for that and can't find it anywhere else. So that's the argument that we sometimes have to make for those collections, that if we want to show impact, we need more data. That we can't show impact if your data is messy, if your data is empty, if your data is partial, then you've already hit your threshold. Like, if you give us all of the metadata you have and it's performing this well on JSTOR, we can't do any better with the information that we have. So we have to either extrapolate from the text, we have to add additional tags or whatever to give more power to that content. And full text doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So being able to scan full text and just get all of that as the metadata isn't the problem. The conversation at Google and other places was a little bit different, where, and I would say at the museums directly was a little bit different, where they're more interested in that immediate, how is this going to impact the size of my audience? So who is it that I'm trying to reach? Am I trying to reach the press? Am I trying to change opinion? Am I trying to change a particular national policy with regards to, technology or something like that? And how can I show that with the thing that I'm building? And that becomes a lot more complicated, but how much data you need to do that. But I've never, unfortunately, found an institution that's willing, outside of maybe the Getty and a few others, that's willing to really kind of invest in building up a data set and then finding out what to do with it after. Like, there's always that assumption and that proof that you have to build the data set with knowing that it's going to have an impact on behavior in some way of your given audience before you're going to invest in developing that data set.
So this is a huge problem, right? Like, if you
Yeah.
let me give you a very quick, like, I have this article, Configuring Art History, where I write this very explicitly. I say, like, if you compare big data in digital art history versus big data in where data really is big, like the CERN, the Atlas experiment, where they produce 40 million gigapixel images per second, which is the exact number of images in the Google Art project, but not the gigapixel images. You only have a couple of hundred of those. So imagine we have all of the 40 million pictures that are in public collections and online actually in gigapixel resolution. We would exactly be in that situation where we'd say, actually, as an art historian, I can go out and say, I look at the corpus of Western art history as established in public collections as a whole, in the very same way as a physicist, I look at the CERN data, or as an astronomer, I look at the JWST or Hubble data. And of course, nobody knew what I'm looking for because they didn't have my idea yet. And I think that is sort of like something which is a really bad catch-22, which we're perpetuating. Like, we all know these Italian archives. I don't need to name names because there's many of them, where you cannot look at the data because the director or whatever is supposedly working on the same material. but they won't have the same ideas. There's nothing wrong with 50 people working, 500 people working in the same material. If the idea is lukewarm, yeah, of course, they're going to write the same thing. But if the idea is hot, even while the data is staring at you and is public to everybody, they will not have the same idea. And I think dataset is something which is really, really crucial, which ties us back to these institutions where there are some institutions that have their data openly available, but these are also the very privileged institutions that have way better access to the very same data. Because obviously, if you have the metadata of the Met, while at the same time you have the multispectral high gigapixel data of the very same painting with the X-rays and everything, you can write an article that will sell better and your catalog will sell better than the master's student who sits in Croatia and just downloads your data and writes an article in some local newspaper but doesn't get it published because they don't have the image rights and they can't afford the image rights. So these kind of things is sort of something where I can see there must be some kind of sea change. And that is also true for JSTOR, right? Like, why do we spearfish? I feel like almost like you catch me while doing it, because that's what I'm doing all the time. I'm literally only spearfishing JSTOR. And I have a little Aaron Schwartz memorial thing in my bookshelf. It was like to remind myself not to download all of JSTOR without asking. But that's the kind of thing. Why is that the case? Why cannot have every humanist have a copy of JSTOR on their machine? Because they could ask way better questions. I mean, we love living in that world, and that is really sad. Like, do you see any place, any way we can arrive in a situation where humanists will have that power, where they can use the full power of their machines, looking at all the data, while staying within spec of the rights, while at the same time not being held back by these paywalls, which are very clearly to benefit some people who own the data, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a reason that I picked that I was lucky enough to work with JSTOR, which is the nonprofit, but like you point out, it has a very complicated history with open material and open content. Everyone there would have loved to be able to release everything and there's the reality of it was such that the publishers would set up an internal kind of moving wall where we would only have access to content within a particular range of years, after before publication. So we didn't have the most recent 2 or 3 years because they wanted that to be in their paywalled aspect, but then they put the rest of it in JSTOR because they thought that was a more open space to put their content. And internally, everybody from the CFO and CEO on down would be saying that assume everything that is on JSTOR is already out in the world. We still have to, internally, the argument was always, how do you create more value for the people who spend the time to come to JSTOR to find that material instead of going to Sci-Hub or wherever else they're going to find those articles that are already downloaded anyway. And trying to build a better experience around the data, around the cataloging, around the relevancy and the ranking and the giving a better search experience so that you wouldn't have to spend as much time going through all of JSTOR to find the 5 articles that you actually care about. So it's not that they're not aware of it, and it's not that they're not trying to find that same. I think, I don't know how it is at the for-profit Elsevier's and everything else of the world that necessarily have a different model of publishing and a different model of sharing humanities information. But definitely at the JSTORs and the nonprofits of the world, they're allies, but they're allies that are trying to work against the same system that's constraining all of the humanities in the same way that you pointed out. That I wish we would have been able to expand more of that content and be able to provide more of it. As evidence, there's even systems they're teaching text and data mining through JSTOR and have a tool about how to extract a data set and specifically out of JSTOR and download that subset and doing all sorts of additional projects like that. So I think they're all open to the idea, but trying to figure out a way to make it sustainable. I think that's the other part of it, is that the sustainability aspect is it costs a lot of money to run a thing like JSTOR, in the sense that the amount of storage and the amount of time how did it all get cataloged and scanned in the first place? How does it, the preservation aspect of it, like those used to be physical journals that are now digitized that aren't taking up library space at a physical institution. That library is expecting to get access to that content for the next 50 years. That's how they sign up their relationship with JSTOR. Like they're not asking for access now. They're saying if JSTOR were to disappear tomorrow, that library still has preservation access to all of that journal content. Like they have to maintain all of that infrastructure and all of that kind of in for a very long time. So that's something, that's a service that otherwise wouldn't exist in the humanities. So I think that that's the argument that's also being made by those people that are trying to kind of expose that content. And the other point I wanted to make just around the cost is that the model of that you have of that humanities scholar and the biology scholar and everyone else, there are those communities of practice that build up around a specific tool, JWST or whatever, that are also very highly funded by external agencies, and that those individual pockets of research that are happening around the world, that money is coming from that, and we don't have that same privilege in the humanities necessarily. That's not something that the lone humanities scholars working in, let's say it was the JSTOR or the Getty or whoever was the JWST of the humanities, like there wouldn't be enough money to support all of those individual humanities scholars, I don't think, from the public funding sources, So again, it's complicated, but that's where my mind goes first anyway.
Nice. You brought up a word which I think was sort of like preceding this sort of like Open Lab seminar, where a couple of months ago we had a chat regarding infrastructure, which I think is super important. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
The actual sort of compute infrastructure that is necessary to sustain the processes that we were talking about today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know a single of those big museums that we talked about before. I don't know a single one who isn't on Amazon or Google Cloud services or hosting all of their content, images and data and processing and websites, and everything else is entirely cloud-based. Everything from their CRMs. Oh my, again, I've got another slide I have to show you guys. There's it's just the number of tech staff. This was like the Cleveland Museum of Art that did a reorganization, or the number of tools and systems that go into deploying JSTOR. It's like any other, think Pinterest, think TikTok, think Netflix. All of the same systems and infrastructure components that go into all of those are the same ones that are powering JSTOR. They're using the same load balancers, the same traffic testing tools, the same hosting environments, all of the same tools. The engineers, they go back and forth between some of these large institutions, and a friend of mine, another one from JSTOR, got another job at Amazon just the other day. Like there's a lot of movement from the engineering skills that are required to push these kinds of large corpus driven websites. It doesn't matter, to some degree, doesn't matter whether or not that's a humanities PDF or a 30-second video of the latest dance craze, that they're interested in that same set of tools and infrastructure. As far as the analysis goes, again, very similar sets of tools, Databricks, a lot of Python skills, and Ruby and everything else to kind of do a lot of data analysis at scale, to be able, the number of people now working that know, Docker and Kubernetes and every other, virtualization system to basically spool up the number of machines they need to do the data analysis on the corpus that they have. All of that is kind of required information to kind of do a lot of this work. And the same way that, 10, 20 years ago, it was offline tools, libraries that you used on your machine to basically crunch through a smaller data set. Now it's the same set of tools, like I keep saying, that a large company would use to host any website or to do any large data scale analysis, is exactly the kind of stuff that you find at a big museum or at a place like JSTOR.
Nice. I think this sort of like an interesting thing, which we have to make ourselves aware, like I'm in the field of art history, at least. There is a history of using the latest technology, but usually we didn't come up with it, right? The slide projector, the black and white photograph, the sort of the laser disc, and all these kind of things, right? We have always been sort of like adopters, not maybe the earliest ones. But then the key question is indeed like, okay, where are these places? So should we look at Amazon, not in JSTOR? Should we not at the Getty? Should we look at Netflix, how to deal with film, and not at a film archive in the country? Should we look at, sort of like, how does Amazon deal with text documents and the annotation and finding the engagement and stuff like that? Because obviously they're good at it. Versus maybe the National Library of Country X is not so much. And so that is a really interesting question. And so how do you think, like, is there a lure from your position to sort of like go to that world or vice versa? Do you think there could be a lure for people from that world to actually go into this more sustained world of like, oh, I need to keep it alive for 50 years, but at the same time, I want to find out something new, which I probably, which may be thought of as like an orchid idea within a company.
I think both ways. I think the skills are what are going to be important in how you choose to apply them. The reason I pulled up the slide is just to see this again is that Cleveland Museum of Art, the digital technology department, right? Each one of these boxes represents at least one person, and there's the technology services and then what they call the digital innovations team. So you've got all of the engineering and IT people that manage all of the AV in the museum, all of the infrastructure support staff and all of that. And then over on the right, you've got analytics and digital and people understanding the user base, the membership, who comes to the museum and all the rest of it. So there's an awful lot of, this is just that department. And the people working on the website and doing the analysis is smaller than the rest of technology operations. The other one is, this is what they had as far as they're just deploying their website and their infrastructure system. So meaning the dams, the digital asset management systems, and some of their other tech. So you've got, this is their internal dams is here in the middle. You can see Amazon S3 off to the side that powers a lot of everything. These are exhibition games over here and other exhibition special content in the upper right. You've got the website and over here in the upper left, along with the collections information, Tessitura, where you keep track of all of your members and membership information, your library systems down below, not to, internal business systems. I show this just as a mid-size, well-funded, North American institution. And this is just the systems diagram they come up with at a very high level, just showing what it is that they have to work with. This kind of infrastructure is the same no matter what kind of thing you're building. And the kind of tools that we kind of see now. So when you ask about people moving from, either from institutions to technology or vice versa, I don't see a lot of a difference. I just, the skills that make all of the people on this call unique are the analysis skills that are missing from a lot of engineers. But perhaps not everyone here has the engineering skills to build a system like that last diagram. And building up both of those is really that unique individual who's able to build that tech infrastructure that can support the kind of analysis that we all want to be doing at scale. I think is kind of what's missing.
So do you, like, this is a maybe a very nerdy question here. As somebody doing analysis on the entire thing within Artstor and JSTOR, you probably ran into the same problem that we run into. Like, we work at corpus scale, we want to look at the whole corpus, and we want to do, sort of like machine learning the whole images and stuff like that, and then have a huge matrix and want to permutate that and stuff like that. So we are in a very, very different world from the API and what you just described. Like this, indeed, the university looks very much similar, right? So there is a day-to-day computer usage, there's people using the web, there's people using the library catalog, but it's not like, hey, okay, I'm going to move 6.5 terabyte of data to this one server because I want to do sort of like some batch machine learning process on it, and the result then moves to this kind of thing. So in the enterprise world, these are two different things. Like there is the streaming world and the API world, which Netflix and Pinterest and Facebook sort of works. Then there's the analysis world where it's much more about moving around large data sets, where it's not about low latency. Latency basically doesn't play a role. Like, I don't care if I wait 10 minutes to transfer the data, but then I really want to have reliable, large bandwidth data transport to do these kind of computations. So there's a completely different load philosophy. And often we are entering institutions that are used to have APIs, that are used to do, you know, one-by-one things. And if I say, hey, I want to ask 350,000 queries to your API, why don't you give me a data dump? You know, they just look at you as like, what? And that is something that sort of biology, astronomy, and so on have solved. Like they optimize their systems towards this sort of like working with large data sets and not caring about latency. And so how do we deal with that? Like, how can we create sort of like this additional thing in institutions that are sort of like supremely focused on day-to-day business, right? They want to serve the person who looks up an artwork on their cell phone, or sort of like goes in, checks out one article, whatever. So how what's your, do you keep that separate in the world that you live, that you say, I do my analysis over here, and then I deploy it low latency here, or like, how do we deal with that?
It depends on the scenario, but yeah, usually there's the usual test, staging, deployment, and production environments. And depending on the questions that we were asking, we would, you know, do it at different, associated with different data sets. So each one of those environments tended to get out of sync in terms of the backend data. The test environment doesn't have all of the JSTOR articles, you know, that you would be running against and things like, for again, exactly those points, that it's a lot easier to run against 1 million articles than it is 16 or 20 million. The analysis that we would do would often be in Databricks or other kind of tools that are completely devoid, you know, disconnected from the rest of production, that you would still be able to connect to the same data source. And that data source would be something that could be stored in any which way. But Databricks would then be the one that you would write your code on top of, and you would be doing queries against that could be in a totally separate pool, and you would not conflict with the accesses to that data set in any kind of, you know, impactful to the user way, that you'd still be able to do those kinds of queries. But yeah, architecturally, you're right. There has to be that distinction between if you're building a production system that does expect, you know, those tens of millions of queries per second or whatever, then that's a very different thing than I can get my answer back in 10 minutes. That the structure that you choose to use, but it's not something that's insurmountable. I think once, depending on how you've stored the data set and what it is that you want to do with it, everything from even simple setting up rules and the provisioning around computing resources for this doesn't have to be complicated if it's just a question largely of storage. Like the storage aspect tends to be the cheapest one out of all of the questions. It's more about latency, like you're pointing out, and replication and all of those issues that tend to scale up the costs. If it was all, you know, Glacier storage and S3, and then it was pulled out only once a year to do a big analysis, that's a very different use case, and IT would understand that from a very different perspective than something that has to have, you know, 30 millisecond read times around the globe. It's a very different sort of thing.
Thank you very much. This was a really exciting discussion. We spent 2 hours, and I think I hope I didn't promise too much. This is really an interesting sort of like layer of the world that we live in that usually is in a way not discussed that way, and it's an essential one. Like, you know, you're operating in an interface which sort of often is, you know, is not the thing you have in the foreground if you're aiming for a paper, for a PhD, for a master thesis, for more visitors for your next exhibition and stuff like that. But it's this more groundswell kind of stuff, but it's what keeps the ship afloat or the airplane in the air. Because without all this, there is no airplane, there is no ship. So thank you very much, Piotr, and
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks everybody for your attention. Hopefully it was time well spent.
Yes, very much. And the Open Lab seminar will return. The program for the whole semester is on kudan.tlu.ee/events/. Thank you very much.
Great.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.